overlaps, and also highlighting the tensions and the differences and the contradictions that exist within our broader coalitional movement building. So if you look back at the last summer school in 2015, PYM went with various Native organizers into Mount Mudu, which is a very popular historic site, because obviously it's settled land. But we did a collective hike with Native youth who were explaining the history of the land, who were explaining the geographical significance of the land, and kind of reestablishing the relationship to the land, and the historical struggles that took place over the displacement from that land. So the folks who were traveling from all over the U.S. got this context of, this is where your school is situated in this moment, right? So even though you're experiencing your own struggles with displacement, with colonization, with violence, the ways in which your presence on this land is also recreating these different narratives and these trajectories of perpetual displacement for other communities, right? And so there was this moment where folks are sitting, and there was a situated conversation that took place between a cross that was planted on the mountain and an American flag that was planted on the mountain, right? So you have these Native folks who are standing in front of these signs, and these are also Native folks who aren't even, some of them are Native to Riverside area, and some of them are folks who are also displaced once, twice, 3 times within their own communities within Turtle Island. So kind of this intensive, physical encapsulation of trajectories of colonization. We're sitting in between it, and they're telling us their narratives of genocide, of displacement, and of contemporary struggles with land. Similarly, I think we have folks who are sitting in the room who went as a Palestinian delegation to Standing Rock, and they worked with Native elders who gave them these historical narratives of all of the different types of Native kinds of collaborations between Palestinian resistance fighters in the 20th century, and then contemporary Native youth building on projects with PYM in terms of what are different ways that in this moment there are these overlaps around land. The erasure of land struggles, especially, that takes place, I think, in some sort of Western frameworks that's so pivotal to conversations of indigeneity, of the Palestinian struggle, et cetera, right? And so I think the idea for this panel is kind of coming from, we have a lot of emphasis in movement culture or in organizing culture on solidarity and alliance, but sometimes it becomes a sort of surface level regurgitation of, we know that we are experiencing oppression and feel camaraderie to these different communities, but there are very concrete projects that are in place structurally that do create overlaps and do create tensions, right? So even though the kind of very popularized phrase from Ferguson to Gaza does include these kinds of implications, what are the actual structural implications in that? What are the structural implications of Zionism and anti-blackness and imperialism, and the actual implications beyond just acknowledging that we both experience oppression as communities, right? So that's kind of, as PYM, where this framework is coming from. We're trying to really ground ourselves in camaraderie that's rooted in movement building. So learning from each other, understanding the contentions and the differences that exist within our movements, times in which we maybe undermine each other in our movements, and times in which I think the workshop before did an amazing job highlighting both the tensions that exist between the communities, but also the moments of working together in liberation struggles. So that's just the kind of preface that I wanted to give for the context of this workshop and the day in general, I think, is the things that we're kind of touching on. This panel in particular, we have folks coming from 3 different organizations. So today we have Christiane Asafa and Torian Webb from B4P, Black for Palestine. We have Jovan Julian and Manzoor Jima coming from Project South. And we have Sunyata Bryant and Toliva Umuya from Malcolm X Grassroots Movement. PYM has a very long-standing relationship with MXGM. We've collaborated on lots of different projects. There's a lot of political building that's taken place. Project South and B4P are organizations that we're very interested in building with and learning more from, because there are so many, I think, radical ideas that are coming out of all of our organizations that can sort of work together synergistically. But so the way that we've kind of structured the workshop today, because even though folks are coming from organizations, these are also individuals who are coming from very powerful trajectories and carrying so much knowledge that they also have to share from their own organizing experiences as individuals. we kind of are going to basically be doing, folks introducing their organizations and the work that they do as individuals, and then each person giving a snippet of either a historical moment or a contemporary moment or some sort of analytic lens on movement building, and seeing where the room takes us with the questions that you might have for these people as we go on. So yeah, thank you guys very much for being here, and feel free to sit there.
Hey y'all, my name is Christiane Asafa, and I'd like to open up the space with a chant if y'all are interested. Yeah? Yes. Okay, cool. So the way this goes is, you can, please stand. So this chant has two phrases. The first one is Mayi Bouye. Mayi Bouye. Mayi Bouye. Mayi Bouye. And the second is I Africa. I Africa. So I'll say Mayi Bouye, and you'll respond with I Africa. And I'll say I Africa, and you'll respond with Mayi Bouye. Okay? Mayi Bouye!
I Africa!
I Africa!
Mayi Bouye!
Mayi Bouye!
I Africa!
I Africa!
Mayi Bouye!
Okay. So does anyone know what Mayi Bouye Africa means? Yeah, that's So this phrase is in Xhosa. That's the language which is spoken in the Western Cape of South Africa. And the phrase was popularized during the struggle against apartheid. And what it means is it's actually like a claim for land, like a demand for the return of land. And it was chanted during the long struggle against apartheid, and still today is chanted. And I think that is a really beautiful way for us to understand the way that land is central to our struggle for political, social, spiritual reasons. And it's a way that really simply unites our struggles as oppressed people, transnationally, right? So in many ways, it would be very appropriate to also say Mayi Bouye Palestine, right? So yeah, I'm Christiane Asafa. I'm coming from Black for Palestine. B4P is a network of hundreds of theologians, academics, students, workers, who we've come together as a network, also organizers and activists, to really focus and think through ways to do political education work with organizers and activists in our community around Palestine and what the international connections are between our two communities. We originally came together in 2015, so we're a new network. We came together around the statement, and since then, we have been in the process of developing a core, but have initiated, some projects around research on things such as Israeli imperialism in Africa. We've been developing political education materials, and we've been in relationship specifically with folks, Palestinians in the diaspora, and we're really interested, right, in the right of return, because that centers land. And so we're in conversation and organizing with some refugees in Lebanon. And so, this is Tari.
Yeah, so Tari Webb, I am based in Chicago, originally from Pittsburgh, and it's good to be here and to share space and to break bread and to have been able to do so with you all. I know at this point many names and faces, so it's good to be here and share with you all in this capacity and learn from my fellow contributors as well as you all. As Christiane mentioned, I'm also coming from B4P. I self-identify as an anarchist and abolitionist Black prophetic Christian theologian. Okay? And for me, that is the lens through which I access these broad kind of issues of race and racism, white supremacy globally, more specifically from an interracial and interfaith landscape. That's my on-ramp. As my big sister said, that's my entry point. And just as an FYI, I teach Black Studies at DePaul University in Chicago. I finishing up a PhD dissertation in religious thought and racial history at Northwestern University. I do think it's important to say. I tend to like to say this in public spaces. I'm explicit about not speaking on behalf of either of these institutions, but absolutely feel free, to write, quote, recommunicate, post, take photos, whatever. I have no problem. Thank you for having me.
Okay, cool. Free to land.
Free to land.
Free to land. Free to land.
Free to land.
By any means necessary.
By any means necessary.
I bring you greetings on behalf of the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement. I am Saliba Obuya. I'm the national organizer currently for the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, and I'm a cadre member of our parent organization, the New African People's Organization. And so just really, really feeling honored to be here in this space. I'm just excited. So, limited sleep, so please bear with me if I'm talking in circles. So the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement is a revolutionary nationalist organization, definitely founded here in the USA. We are fighting for the self-determination of Black folks in the U.S. empire. We do look at the United States as an empire, and we believe that the Black nation does exist in this empire, and that we have the right to self-determination. When we say self-determination, we definitely believe that as nation talk. Because I know, it's like, I have self-determination to, define myself, name myself, be my full self. But we're saying we, as a nation, have the self-determination to govern ourselves. We have the right to protect and defend ourselves. And we do also identify a piece of this empire as our nation land. So it was really something to hear that quote earlier that we are living fractured in exile outside of our nation. Although we do identify the Deep South with USA, Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, and South Carolina as our 5-nation state area of territory. But we know that we do live throughout the United States, and we identify as New Africans, understanding that as Pan-African nationalism, that we do have connections still to the continent of Africa, but through Ma'afa and the same that happened, our ancestors went many places, not just to the USA, so we have a large diaspora around us. So I'm just the national organizer for MXGM. We are founded on 6 principles. I'm trying to keep my intro very short. Outside of that, I've just been organizing in the Southeast for about the last 12 years. I've definitely been honored to meet other movements in the global South, and so my little niche of area is definitely looking at the South to global South connection in ways that we do fight from a grassroots perspective for liberation, and definitely honoring other nation fighting movements. So then we can also see how we build and link together to hopefully ultimately gain our own individuals' liberation. I'll end just with saying, oftentimes I think about what is my Emmett Till? Emmett Till is a youth who was murdered. Have y'all heard of Emmett Till before? So he's a youth murdered in the U.S. South. And then I just think about these moments because there's points in our history where I think people do question their colonization, do question their origins. Where were we before? And so Katrina oftentimes bring that up because I know the Gulf Coast disaster, it did bring the conversation of racism again back in this country. And then you can't think about racism without thinking about history. And when you think about history, you do begin to ask yourself, where are people's origins? Where do these people come from? And so we acknowledge that our connection is back to the continent of Africa. We may not be able to then put, we came from this country, we came from this land, you have to understand why is that? Why don't we know this history, and why can't we place ourselves back on our soil? And so that's just very big for me as we continue to move forward, because I know when we say that we're a revolutionary nationalist organization, we believe in a black nation, we look at the Southeast, the Deep South, as our nation land, it just brings up questions of, well, what do you mean about having a black nation in the United States? What does it mean about having ties to that land, and even have ownership to that land? Because we do understand that we're on indigenous land, what was referred to as Turtle Island, and not just the United States of America. And then, so I'll get into that later in my portion of thinking about nationalism, but I just wanted to bring that into the room, that this conversation, when we talk about self-determination, does include land, and does remember this piece about right to return, but then also where we at now, if we don't readily have a place to go back to. So.
All right, free the land, comrades.
Free the land.
So I'm Sinyaka Bryant. I get the pleasure to work with this comrade right here. She's my leader. I'm the National Secretary of the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, and I'm also a cadre member of the New African Peoples Organization. Leva laid out our organization very well. I'll get to the principles, right? So one principle, self-determination, right? Human rights, right? And end the genocide. Freedom for political prisoners and prisoners of war. Reparations, right? And an end to sexist oppression. Right? Those are our 6 principles that we organize around and build our movement off of. Right? One of the things that about me and my background is that I've got nationalism in my family going back to at least the 1830s. At least, as far as what we can track. All right, so my family fought in the Second Seminole War in Florida. Right, and we don't know exactly if we were part of the Maroons that were there. We don't know if we were liberated by the Seminole natives and the Maroons. We don't know if we were part of the tribe, right? But we do know that we were caught up in those events and fought in that war. Right, and that history carried on through my family, through the Civil War, through fighting the Klan for our land in Arkansas, during the Reconstruction period, to great-grandparents being Garveyites, to my dad doing, helping Panthers and the way he helped Panthers, and then me now rocking with the Leland Malcolm X Grassroots Movement. Right, so it's like that generational fight. That really informs where I come from. Khalifa spoke a little bit about the organization being both one rooted in national liberation struggle, but then also rooted in Pan-Africanism. And those are our 2 supreme objectives, right? Liberating ourselves here and liberating African people wherever they're found in the world, right? And that includes Palestine. Right? And we're going to get into it, but we see Palestine as part of Africa. Right? We see this historically, and we're going to get into it a little bit, but we can't talk about full Pan-Africanism and full liberation of the African world without the liberation of Palestine. Right? And the Pan-African liberation movements all understood that. Right? So we're going to talk about that.
My name is Jovan Julian. I'm here with Project South, the Institute for the Elimination of Poverty and Genocide. It's a Southern-based leadership development organization that's focused on a couple of things, including popular education around politics and economics, and also around building governance structures and working that out. I'm a regional organizer there, working in the legacy of Taliban, who actually helped to do much of the work, including to midwife the Southern Movement Assembly into existence, and that's a piece of what we do. Personally speaking, I'm coming out of a Haitian context, so my family is of Haitian descent. We come from the island, and have been fighting alongside and in the trend of history and as a front line in this battle around colonialism and imperialism for a long time. And so part of what we'll talk about and get into is what are the connections and how do they play out in the lives of folks in the Caribbean? How do they play out in like our families' lives and in today, but also across a historical context?
Greetings, everybody. My name is Manzoor Chima. I'm honored to be here. I'm also a member of Project South, a regional organizer. I'm originally from Pakistan. I came as a student in 2000 as a medical research student. But I'm blessed to be mentored and trained by Black liberation leaders, Saladin Muhammad, Shafi Ambalia. Yesterday there was mention about the League of Black Revolutionary Workers. So we are blessed that they founded our organization called Muslim for Social Justice in 2013. And we call ourselves an organization that devoted to pursuing Muslim liberation theology. And in 2015, we founded an organization called Married Movement to End Racism and Islamophobia. And a little bit about this background of Islamophobia, which I'll talk more, that the way we define Islamophobia is that it's a racialized oppression against Black, brown, and Muslim people locally and globally. It's not just against Muslims, but people who are perceived as Muslims. And it's part of war on terrorism, it's part of imperialism, basically. And this is really important from our conception because of the training by the Black liberation leaders, and also, if you know the quote from Malcolm X, that you cannot have capitalism without racism. So this is the core of the work when we talk about, and Muslim almost has, in other words, become a political category. Muslims are the new communists. And to us, we are looking from that cross-section and then connecting it to the original anti-Black racism. It's an extension of anti-Black racism. And also in case of Islam, that Islam, we believe, came through slavery. Up to 15 to 30% of slaves were Muslim. But also a significant number of American Muslims are African-American Muslims, but they are also erased by the popular imagination of immigrant or non-Black Muslims. The other organization that I'm part of course, is Project South, that Joanne mentioned, which is again also founded by Black radical tradition. And also Southern Movement Assembly is an ongoing project, and building Black-Brown assemblies, Black-Brown Muslim, and so I will be very happy to talk more about that. Thank you so much.
All right. So I'll open up. We're going to go kind of broad, kind of big picture. Like I was saying earlier, coming from a Pan-African land, like the whole term, the Middle East, we know that term is the Middle East of what? You know what I mean? Like that's not a term or a point of reference or a geopolitical reality that fits any of our people. Doesn't fit any of our history. Right? When you look at the actual history of the regions, both on the western side of the Red Sea and on the eastern side of the Red Sea, right? We look at African people being in Arabia for at least 70,000 years. Right? The first African diaspora, very first, right? It's like folks' ancestors in this room, part of that first African diaspora. Right? We look at the tribes that exist on the eastern side of the Red Sea and on the western side of the Red Sea. I'm going to name some of them. Banu Sulema, right? Banu Faras, right? Bagab, right? Banu Laka, right? All these tribes exist on both sides of that sea. Right, for generations and generations and generations, before Rome, before Britain, right? Damn sure before Israel, right? But we can't let, so first and foremost, we can't let the empires of the world define our relationships to each other, right? We can't let their very faulty notions of geography, right, separate us. Right? They talk about North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, right? Like folks weren't migrating through the Sahara, like there aren't Muslims in Africa. How did they get to be Muslims in Africa if there wasn't, a vast migration of people, like back and forth? Okay. The people in our liberation movements understood this history. And in part because when we look at the struggles against, when we go beyond the notions of just the empires and look at it as more like wars of different civilizations and whole economic structures in contention with each other, right? You look at this fight against Rome, the Roman Empire in the East and in the West, right? Those are some of the original roots of what became like some of the solidarity movements over time, right? When you look at North Africa, right? When you look at like the Almoravids, right, in North Africa, right? Who fought against the incursions of the call it like Rome 2.0, right? With the Catholic kind of empires that were being built up. They defended a lot of that land and reclaimed land that Rome had taken from them, right? So we're talking about like a culture that spanned all the way from Yemen, right, into Spain, right, before Rome was ever a country or an idea for an empire. That was like a whole cultural zone, right? So going into fast forward a couple centuries, right? With our national liberation movements, we understood this history, right? When we talked about the creation of Israel and like the colonization of all what we're gonna call, like, for us, we call that like Northeast Africa, right? When we look at the colonization of that and like the Sykes-Picot sort of treaties and like that history, right? We see that as being like the tail end of the scramble for Africa, right? It's directly related to that scramble for Africa. It happened between 1881 all the way up to 1914. Right? And when we look at the fallout of that, one, you got the creation of the European nation states, right? That model being replicated in our regions, where we didn't have those sorts of state-type structures, right? It's foreign structure. We had our own types of states. We had our own empires. We had our own economies, right? But that European nation-state structure, right, and being imposed on our peoples at the same time, right? It's not a coincidence that all this is happening within like a 20, 30-year period of each other, right? Not a coincidence at all. When we look at the response to that, right? The liberation movements happening in Ghana, liberation movements happening in South Africa, in Algeria, right? In Tunisia, all building with each other, right? And then comrades in the north, because they speak the same language, come from the same tribes oftentimes, right? Building with the comrades in the rest of Arabia, right? All sharing movement history, all building solid relationships, right? And then you also have, you have disagreements and struggles and beef, It all is, it's a holistic thing, right? But we do have direct relationships, and with the creation of the state of Israel, from the beginning, you have people that see that as the colonial situation that it was, and are connecting it to the moves to decolonize the region. They're not buying. Some people bought it, yes, but a lot of folks that were involved directly in the national liberation struggle saw that for what it was and moved to build relationships with folks. A lot of folks in the diaspora from those regions also came into African countries with those stories, right? And built relationships with the liberation movements on the continent. Fast forward a couple of decades later, right? You've got folks in Umkhonto we Sizwe, you got folks in the Pan-African Congress, you got folks in Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde, right, doing training in Palestine, right, military training that they would be able to take back to their homelands, right. You have the creation of the United Arab Republic, right, with Nasser in Egypt trying to unite Egypt and Syria, and even Yemen at one point in time. It didn't last very long, right? But you have this motion, the same pan-Arab motion being connected to a pan-African motion that Nasser was also part of, right? And I'm not trying to glorify the comrade or anything like that, but he had a role that was helpful, right? He also did some things that weren't helpful as far as the treatment of some of the indigenous people and the Aswan High Dam situation and things like that. Right? But we do have that relationship, right? And so on both ends, right? On the end of the Europeans, they see the colonization of Palestine connected to the colonization of the rest of Africa, and then on the other end of it, the Africans, right, and the Palestinians and the Egyptians, right, all seeing those struggles linked up, right, and as a necessary the need to unify those struggles, seeing that the Zionists were a very, very strong threat. One thing to note, you have the Israeli Zionists directly impacting several of the wars in Africa, arming multiple sides, disrupting the liberation forces in Africa, giving South Africa, the apartheid government of South Africa, the atomic bomb, right? Which is how we know that Israel has one, because we know that they're the ones that gave it to South Africa. Right? We know about the Israeli spying on Black liberation movement forces in the United States, right? That were doing work around apartheid work, doing work to try to create rifts within our social movements, to confuse our people about who was a friend and who was an enemy. And all the while, you have the Organization of African Unity, which is it's a mixed institution. You have the national liberation struggles, and then you also have the neo-colonial forces involved, right? And you have Israel working its way into an observer nation status within the Organization of African Unity. Right? All the while, other nations in the Organization of African Unity are getting trained by Palestinian liberation fighters, right, to liberate their homeland. Right, so you have this history. So then you come to 2002, well, 2001 into 2002. Right, you have the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa. Right, the Zionists in the United States walk out, right, because of the question of Zionism being racism and reparations being owed for the transatlantic slave trade. Right. They walk out. 2002, the Organization of African Unity dissolves, and you have the formation of the African Union. Israel is kicked out, partially because of what they did in the World Conference Against Racism. Israel is kicked out. They lose their observer status. Now you have Palestine as an observer within the within the African Union, and Israel fighting to try to get its way back in. Right, and part of it is that they're trying to stop the bloc of African countries in the United Nations from always backing the Palestinians, right, in these international forums. Right? I saw the 2-minute thing, so I'm gonna stop there past the mic. I'm gonna stop because the other points are going to go too long.
Well, yeah, I guess, Sanika, thank you. I'm going to spend a few minutes kind of using Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa as a case study for some of the things that Sanika introduced in terms of Pan-Africanism. For a few reasons. One, so that we can begin to understand Ethiopia as a third world imperial democracy, and additionally to understand the historical and political and economic arrival of Ethiopian Jews to 48, and also like the existence of all of these African asylum seekers that we see in the Hola detention center in the Nakab Desert, right? Yeah, so the way that I'm going to structure this is just kind of giving like a historical analysis on governance in Ethiopia and Ethiopia's long history and relationship with Zionism. And then I'll give like a few contemporary examples that kind of complicate this relationship. So to begin, to kind of like, you know, it's very true that Ethiopia exists as this beacon of light for Pan-Africanists across the diaspora, particularly because during the time of colonialism, you know, Ethiopia successfully like defeated Italians, the Italian colonizers, and was one of 2 African countries that wasn't colonized, as Ethiopia and Liberia. But the reality is that despite the fact that Ethiopia was able to defeat Italian colonizers, in many ways Ethiopia itself has been a colonizer in the Horn of Africa, right? It was an imperial monarchy up until 1973, when Haile Selassie was overthrown by People's Revolution. But prior to his overthrow, he had a very strategic relationship with the U.S. And during the Cold War, helped facilitate the construction of Kaglu Station, which was a U.S. military base in Asmara, which is today located in Eritrea. And this military base was actually used to surveil the Soviet Union, and also to maintain like surveillance over the Middle East, to maintain, you know, and to maintain Israeli interests in the region, to maintain and protect Israeli interests in the region. So Haile Selassie kind of facilitated. He was the last emperor of Ethiopia. He facilitated this imperial relationship, and after he was overthrown, the military dictatorship known as the Derg maintained this relationship with the U.S. and deepened its relationship specifically with Israel, right? So this is the time when we see the first arrival of Ethiopian Jews to 48. This fascist, you know, during the 70s and 80s, this is when we see a bunch of Ethiopians migrating fleeing and becoming refugees, creating the Ethiopian diaspora that we see today. The Ethiopian and Eritrean diaspora, and Somali as well, to be honest. And so the first exchange that occurred between Israel and Ethiopia for this population of Jews actually occurred at a time when Mengistu's Derg regime really needed military power in order to repress its population. So in exchange for this population of Jews that serve as, an underpaid working class in Israel, Ethiopia received military training and military weapons. And this time was really interesting because as Ethiopians flee and into the diaspora, there was actually a crew of Ethiopian students in Germany that created the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party, and they were trained by Palestinians. And they returned to their homeland and served as a vanguard party to struggle against this Derg regime. And they participated in an armed struggle and helped overthrow this regime. So despite that, at this large institutional state level, there's this, clear imperial relationship between Ethiopia and Israel, when we talk about the dispossessed, right, or the wretched of the earth, as Frantz Fanon said, there is a very organic and strategic and important relationship between poor of Ethiopia and Palestinians, right, the people who are forced off of their land. And so as we move into the newest government in Ethiopia that we see today, again, this relationship between Zionists and Ethiopia continues to maintain itself. Israel today serves as an investor in Ethiopia, helping with development projects, or also known as the liberalization of the Ethiopian economy. Ethiopia is currently touted as the fastest growing economy in the continent of Africa. But what that really means is that they're really invested in neoliberal capitalism. And as we know, capitalism depends on the exploitation of poor people, right? And so Israel is definitely has its hand in maintaining exploitation and oppression and violence in Ethiopia today. But in exchange for this positive relationship with the state and investment, we see the continued arrival of Ethiopian Jews to Israel. The latest was actually in September of last year. I think there were 9,000 Ethiopian Jews who left a camp they were staying at right outside of Addis Ababa and arrived in Tel Aviv. And we know that Zionism is white supremacy, right? And that's very apparent in Israel and very apparent in the experiences of Black people in Israel, right? Who are low-wage workers, who experience police violence, who experience sterilization, right? Which has long been used as a tool for eugenics and population control. But at the same time, this contradiction manifests whenever we see, right? The Ethiopian Jews are also very invested in Israel, right? And the state of Israel, who are struggling for rights and recognition within the state of Israel. And in fact are a part of committing violence as IDF soldiers, on a day-to-day basis against Palestinians. So in addition, the other way that we really see and can understand the presence of Africans in Israel is, again, through the asylum seekers. The other thing is that, Israel, through arms trade dealings with various governments throughout the continent of Africa, is responsible for the destabilization of the East African region and this crisis of refugees that we see crossing the Sahara, the Mediterranean, right, the Nakab Desert, seeking some type of stability and refuge through arms trade dealings with South Sudanese rebels, right, with the Ethiopian government, who has been consistently at war with Eritrea, and also Eritrea itself, which is experiencing a huge in Eritrea, the youth population is almost completely absent because so much of the population has fled the country for varying reasons. But Israel, through maintaining this relationship of trading arms, trading weapons, training the Ethiopian military, has destabilized the entire East African region and is in fact responsible for the reason why we see asylum seekers, right? In 48. Yeah, and so I think those are the points that I really wanted to hit to express to you all that just through understanding the historical and political and economic conditions through which Africans are arriving to Palestine, and also recognizing how deeply related our people are on so many different levels, we can really begin to develop the foundation to not just, as Yaz was saying, discussing the way that our people experience violence and oppression similarly, but actually begin developing and exchanging strategies for building power. And to hit a bit on the Pan-Africanism bit, it's so important to recognize that even beyond Ethiopia, right, Israel is playing the same role. Like in the Rwandan genocide, Israel provided weapons to both the Hutus and the Tutsis, right? But today pretends as if it's an ally and close friend to President Kagame of Rwanda. It's almost as if the memory has been forgotten. We see it in South Africa, or even during the independence struggles throughout the continent of Africa in the 60s and 70s. Israel played a very oppositional force, right? Allying itself with the US and the apartheid South African government to suppress independence struggles in Namibia and Mozambique and Tanzania, right? And so Israel clearly has aligned itself with this neoliberal global order of power that has never been interested in the working class or workers of the world. Thank you.
So I'm gonna add on to everything that's been said here, but just to take a particular lens from the Caribbean and particularly from Haiti and my Haitian experience, experience of my family. I think one place to start before going into those examples of how Israel has actually played that same role in the Caribbean is to hit a little bit, I think, on some of the just some general thoughts on anti-Blackness, I think, and particularly in how we understand our history and how we get here. I've been part of a couple of conversations, and I think it's important to uplift and also to recognize the, and when I say anti-Blackness, I think a particular Western lens that looks at Western thought is the only way for us to interpret our own stories and our own histories. So, for example, in looking at the Caribbean as a home of revolution, that is to say that as we look at a period of revolution in France, in America, in Haiti, all around the late 1700s and early 1800s, that often we don't take the time, or I haven't seen the time taken to really understand what is the history of the Haitian Revolution, where does it come from, what does it mean for slaves to be revolting rather than workers, and what are the political theories that folks actually generate around that thought, and how much do we bring that into our spaces now as we think and move, as another way to look at things that's not just attached to, let's say, to Marx or to democratic liberal thought out of France, but to take the experience from Black folks who have fought for their liberation and created theory around that as well. As an extension of that, I would say that the Cuban Revolution is another place to look at that. Often it's framed as a revolution through Marx connected to the USSR, right? But actually also it's a Black revolution. It's a revolution of Black folks in the Caribbean who come out of a history of slavery and enslavement and find a way to create community that actually is opposed to this neoliberal order that we're currently in. So I think that sometimes is how anti-Blackness can show up for us in the room, in one way that we can find ways to kind of battle that and to decolonialize our mindsets even around how we organize and do our work. In Haiti, that political context or the context of that imperialism and Zionism plays out in a number of ways. I think y'all did the reading on Israel and the World from IJAN, and that lays out some of the, what I would call the hard power techniques of that in terms of supporting militaries, giving arms to folks, etc. But there's also the soft power game that is being played at the same time. The economics, the religious game, etc. And that's been done through history, I think, and it's important to recognize how that battle has delegitimized a lot of our cultures, right? So in Haiti, there's a battle of Catholicism versus voodoo. And what is your experience with that sort of religion at your heart? That's also some of the way that we've deconstructed or delegitimized the Haitian Revolution, is to say it comes out of this practice of devil worship or something of that sort. So just to bring that forward into how that plays out in the Caribbean today, it's through this soft power of looking at economics, political leadership, as well as religious leadership. A very significant effort to build what they call a multi-generational firewall against anti-Semitism in the Caribbean, and to use Caribbean nations to support Israeli policy, to step out of world meetings when Israel is on the block, is to say that let's build this long-term relationship so that you can support us around anti-Semitism. That happens through religious connections to our conservative religious groups that have a lot of power in Haiti, right? Whether that's Catholicism, whether that's Christian religious leaders, but connecting, supporting them, monetary connections that for us mean that our people aren't able to practice our cultural experience, aren't able to grow that our cultural legacy is actually under attack. And so that's one place where there's connection, I think, between our communities and to recognize how do we defend cultural experience and cultural legacy. There's also the connection to the economics of the region. Israel uses technology as a method of gaining imperial power in the Caribbean, right? Whether that's through water filtration, it's through agricultural products. It also happens through this NGOization of, like, say, a country like Haiti, where alongside the U.S., Israel, South Korea, and a number of other sort of powers that are aligned with this legacy of imperialism and colonialism in the U.S. today are all in a fight to see where do our folks who have these bents towards how to shape community, instead of having that happen internally, how do we export them elsewhere and make them a part of our project? So we certainly see streams of that happening kind of collectively and all the time. And finally, one big thing to uplift around the Caribbean and in particular in Haiti again, is the role of Jewish industry and Zionist industry, and coming in and taking over the infrastructure of a country, right? So the richest man in Haiti is from a family of Syrian descent, Syrian Jewish descent, who have been controlling the Haitian government, or part of controlling the Haitian government, through industry for the past 100 years.
Can you say
right?
what his name is? His name?
Yeah, Biggio, Biggio. I forget. I think it's. I can get that to you in a second. But they are the largest. How the Biggio group states it is that they're the largest supporter of the state, the largest private supporter of the state through their taxes. And what's also true is it's not just through taxes, but also the larger structure around our government, the corruption that occurs due to the lack of resources that allows a control of the entire Haitian state towards an alignment with Israel's strategic objectives on an international scale. And those aren't my words, right? Those are the words, like literally if you go to the website of, where is it? The Caribbean Israel Leadership Coalition. You can find the actual objectives that lay out a religious, economic, and political alignment towards creating a bloc of nations that are connected to Israel economically and that's supported politically on the international scale. And how that happens is through cultural repression, economic repression, and poverty and genocide being exported and supported, not just in the past through hard means, but also presently through what folks might call soft means.
So continuing with the earlier conversation that Israel is a project of racism and white supremacy, I'm going to again focus more on Islamophobia and what role Israel and Zionism plays in that. Basically, as earlier mentioned, that Israel policies towards Palestinians, towards black Jews, sterilization, as well as imperialism globally is of course well known. But in terms of Islamophobia, and Islamophobia has also very deep roots. I mean, you can go up to Crusades or 1492, but I'm talking the modern context and the role played by Israel and Zionism. That you will see that the racialization of Arabs and Muslims actually was started by Israel. And in the popular imagination of the USA, in the culture, in the media, and earlier it was mentioned yesterday, the work of Professor Jack Shaheen, who has documented how that racialization has happened, is really, haunting now the Muslims and how this whole Islamophobia industry has been created. Some of the most vocal and most rabid anti-Muslim voices are actually pro-Israel voices. David Horowitz or Clarion Project. It's a multi-million-dollar industry basically that is demonizing and dehumanizing Muslims. And of course, then Israel's role in racism domestically in the USA is also evident, and also with the training of the law enforcement by Israeli forces. Police, ICE, and even FBI have been trained by Israeli security forces. But in general, how Islamophobia actually is a weapon, is a racist weapon. You can also see that anti-terrorism legislation is being introduced to penalize even Black Lives Matter. Our own state of North Carolina has passed a law that says blocking of roads is economic terrorism. So this war on terrorism and this Muslim language is actually a weapon and a tool to also discipline, suppress the dissent, voices of dissent. Talking about the South, where we live, how it's manifesting, also understanding South's, repression historically, but the promise to us, South is also home to 57% of the black population in the USA. So when we are talking about building a movement, anti-black racism, you have to really think of the South, which in itself is an empire within USA. And I know later on Taliba is going to talk more about that. But more than 50% low-income people also live in the South. South has a deep anti-union movement which is tied to Jim Crow. In our own state of North Carolina, based on Jim Crow law in the late 50s, collective bargaining by public employees is banned, and it is because the black workers and public workers were unionizing at the time. More than 50% U.S. military bases are in the South, U.S. South. And also South has this particular brand of Christian Zionism. There is a, saying that Bible Belt is Israel's safety belt, which has basically used particular kind of language and pro-Israel, advocacy by Christian Zionist forces. And from that context, understanding the solidarity by black liberation movement in the South is very, very important, because they are some of the most, I would say, critical forces, vanguard forces, who are fighting not just racism, but also global imperialism and Zionism. And one of the forces that I am blessed to work is Black Workers for Justice, who published about 30 years ago a paper on connecting black liberation and Palestine liberation movement. And they have the largest public workers union run by rank and file black workers called UE Local 150, United Electrical and Machine Workers Union, which passed a BDS resolution against Israel. And that was endorsed by the National Union in Pittsburgh, UE, making it the only national union to pass BDS resolution. And they got under severe attacks internally as well as externally by Zionist forces. But they still fought back and they persisted and they won. So it's very, very important to understand, despite all the struggles, that they are some of the leading forces in the South and the Black liberation forces, who are following the Black radical tradition, that are fighting back, and where we need solidarity. But I also want to talk, when we're talking about solidarity, that we need to also address there are some contradictions too. There are some challenges too, especially in the immigrant population or diasporic population or non-black immigrant Muslims as well as other immigrants. That I would say basically that path to success, in this capitalist economy, unfortunately, forces many people to collaborate with white supremacy. Many of the non-black immigrant population has aspiration for whiteness. And then that is a hurdle for solidarity. We can talk about, historically, there was connection between Palestine and the Black Panther and stuff. But in reality, look at around neighborhoods, look at our community, and how they have become part of the I would say, or collaborators with the white supremacy. And also there's a culture of anti-black discrimination in many immigrants from our own cultures, unfortunately, and racism. There's a very important book by Vijay Prashad called Karma of Brown Folk, which goes in the history of this anti-black racism in the immigrant population. Many of the black and brown immigrants who came to the USA after 1965 visa policy change, thanks to the civil rights movement, but very quickly they were recruited by white supremacist forces. In our own state of North Carolina, one of the most racist politicians, I would say the most racist politician in the USA, Jesse Helms, brought a lot of immigrants, professional immigrants, doctors, physicians, engineers from immigrants. And then they became really loyal, basically, supporters of him. Many of the physicians, immigrant physicians, used to invite him as a chief guest, a speaker. So there's unfortunately a huge, I would say, also part of racism in the community that we need to really challenge. And also the way our business communities operate, the convenience stores, in the black population, that oftentimes are serving exploiting in the black community. The largest mosque in North Carolina is built on a land given to freed slaves in 1867. And they have gentrified the neighborhood, and even the black neighborhoods are opposing that mosque. So there is this level of a literal apartheid between black Muslims and non-black Muslims diasporic that needs to be challenged if we are talking about building solidarity. And also, unfortunately, at least in the South where we are working, the lot of BDS work has become also very white work. Most people who are doing actively BDS work are the white churches. They have a lot of funding, they pension, they can buy. Black churches don't have that much wealth. And the Jewish organization, some very good allies, but by default it has become very white work. The work that's done by black liberation does not even receive solidarity from the Palestinian community or the Muslim in general. As I mentioned, UE Local 150 passed resolution for BDS, UE passed, they didn't even get any support from the Palestinian community. And this is an organization that was risking its own survival because they got under severe attacks by Zionist organizations, locally to globally, and they persisted and they won. So we really have to address some of the contradictions too that exist within the community. And that's why I really want to basically, and then in terms of how these divisions happen, I would say this whole panel was titled Anti-Blackness, Imperialism, Zionism. And then when we're talking about imperialism, we have to talk imperialism inside the USA too. This is a divide and conquer strategy of imperialism. What they do is pit people against each other. They also pit oppressed people against each other, pit marginalized people against each other. And this is the kind of dynamics we also have to work against. In terms of next steps, quickly, we can talk more later on, but Muslim for Social Justice and Mary, that's why we feel that all our work, either on Palestine or Islamophobia, has to keep on forefront the analysis of racism, anti-black racism. Not just in theory but practice, because without that, we are really doing disservice to the movement. And connect it to the struggle that has happened, and also take leadership from the black radical and the black liberation movement. Project South, which is also following the Black radical tradition founded by Black radicals, and has facilitated Southern Movement Assembly, which creates spaces for Black, Brown, Muslim, and other marginalized communities. And I'm so happy that this space has been created. I'm hoping this is not the last time, and we're gonna continue that. So there will be Southern Movement Assembly 7 in eastern part of North Carolina, in a former plantation, slave plantation. Eastern part of North Carolina was mostly, home of slavery, and it was converted into one of the first schools for freed, slaves. So there will be a Southern Movement Assembly 7 there. We hope, Palestine Youth Movement and the folks there should come and build the movement together. We envision, how we strategize fighting local to global oppression. And in the end, I will quote Fannie Lou Hamer that none of us is free until all of us are free.
Okay, great. So again, Freedom Land, I'm Saliba with MXGM, and I'm trying to stay within time. So I wanted to talk about nationalism and when we think of that, and language is very, very important. So it can be well, where do we start this history? Where do we start this time? Because it's sitting on my chest, in the history of the USA and in this empire, slaves were not free. To be enslaved Africans were free. And then we went into another process of oppression and repression. And I think that's really big because I'm pretty sure as we can experience with our fights, the erasures of identities and connections then put you in this world and then where do you go and where are we going? So just to even think about that timeline, when we think about the timeline of Black resistance, or what does that look like in the United States or in a certain period of timeline, how many of us here, like Abraham Lincoln, freed the Black people in the USA? Yes. That's how we got, with the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment, Black folks would be free. And then we jump into the Civil Rights Movement because Reconstruction is happening. And within the Civil Rights Movement, folks were fighting for policy to not be second-class citizens and all these pieces. And then we jump possibly to the Black Power movement. When you hear of that time, the 60s and the 70s, organizations like the Black Panthers, leaders like Malcolm X. And so then we jump to now. Now, for some reason, we're inside of this Black Liberation or Black Lives Matter movement. Have we heard of that? That's what time period we're in. And inside of that, there's about 50 years of history. And what happens is that if we jump from the Civil Rights Movement to Black Lives Matter, we miss this period of intense resistance and this intentional
You missed what period? Mm-hmm. What was that? You missed what period?
I was saying we missed this period of Black resistance and nationalism resistance. So, because my part that I really want to talk to, and hopefully trying to build on this and to then get into conversation and questions, is really lifting up nationalism and Black revolutionary nationalism, because oftentimes it was there were some slaves in the United States. White people thought that was bad. We freed them, and now we're all one country of equal citizenship, lived experiences. And then we just need to continue to change these laws. But what has been an intentional erasure of history is that the cry for Black folks was a human rights movement. We were talking about human rights on an international piece, and then we wanted to be recognized as a Black nation. And because that was oftentimes the rally cry and the demand, that part is often erased. So even now that folks are still looking out at state violence, and it's expanding its narrative around boycott and divestment, active solidarity with Palestine, there's still this disconnect that actually this was a long history of what was happening. And so I just wanted to really lift up the movement that we are a part of as MXGM and the history that we stand on as being the New African Independence Movement, because what we have stated, and again in our introduction and in that history, that we are a nation. And now that there's an empire in the USA that is colonizing us and that are keeping us from our self-determination, which means that we should be able to have our land here, that we should be recognized as a nation and thus given or really acknowledge self-determination, which is really this connection that we see as moving forward with our relationship with Palestine and other nationalist movements. So we see that with Puerto Rico, we see that with indigenous folks of Hawaii, we see that in fights in Alaska. So when we're thinking about nationalism, there are two kinds that kind of show up in the USA in the context of Black nationalism, oftentimes noted as revolutionary nationalism or reactionary nationalism. And this is oftentimes held the narrative. So it's like, oh, if we had self-pride, if we acted a certain way, if we had self-respect, if we did self-help, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, just assimilate into the structures that are here, we would be free, we would be recognized, we can get our nationalism that way. With revolutionary nationalism, that actually says, no, we are a nation and we want complete separation from the empire. We want this self-determination. And so some of our current wins look like in Jackson, Mississippi, through this piece around assemblies, we were able to say that the population of Jackson, Mississippi is about 80% Black folks. So if that's our population, we should be able to govern ourselves, we should be able to decide how our society goes, and we should be in controlling of essentially this land. And so the conversation has been like, well, is that electoral politics? Are we assimilating into this process that exists? And we're saying, no, that's not the case, but we should show that we can practice governance of ourselves. And once we see that, we also see the attacks that are happening there. Jackson, Mississippi is a capital city of Mississippi, but yet there's a fight for their border, there's a fight for their land, and there's a fight for their airport, which is really their economic stature. And so we see that these are the same assaults and attacks that happens at global levels, that happens at different national levels, and we see that playing out in the city. But when we said that, hey, we are still 80%, we should control that, and the people of that city say, yes, we do agree, and the mayor who is now in place now, Chokwe Antalamumba, he was, he was able to win that with over 90% of the people's vote turnout, even though he was outspent by 2 to 1%, even though there was demonizing of, oh, he's a revolutionary nationalist, oh, he's, and he actually was really assaulted through Zionism in itself, right? Mm-hmm. Like, they started to, like, throw all these different pieces, like, this is going to threaten those, the interests of us on a global level, even to the point of, like, our borders being taken away, some of these laws that were brought up with how the South moves and, like, Donald Trump enforced. It was like, we can actually get this stuff passed, and that's totally between how are we seeing, like, our domestic stuff have impact on the global level in other, like, national conversations. So I think one of the other just larger pieces to tie back, we do see our fight for self-determination is a victory and a win that we need here domestically, representing the Black nation that exists, but we also still see that through our second objective, as Yako was saying, with Pan-Africanism. So we understanding that our continent, Africa, and the diaspora, as Jovan often brings up, the islands in the Caribbean, also are seeing, like, where is our diaspora, where are our people, and how do we connect and build that freedom. And I think that kind of gets us into transitioning with some mythology pieces, though. We do understand that will look like act of solidarity, and not in the words of, like, oh, let's stand up and say we're pro-Palestine, but then been in conversations where we know that maybe folks are receiving Zionist funding. So what does it actively be like? No, this actually means that this is our position. We're not going to support, like, agendas in ways that hides the true intentional means. We see that even now with our Black some of the active movements now, whether they're grassroots structure, like nonprofit structure, and what is our relationship with nonprofits, and then what is the relationship to funding, because we know that again has global impacts. Yeah, I think I want to. Yeah, so then just holding up again, though, understanding that the importance and the assault methods are the same, that displacement is real, that we don't just see that outside of in other countries and other nations across the world. We see that through the experience here in the United States and inside of this empire. And yeah, I'm looking back because I lost my train of thought where I was going, but. Yeah, so I think I'm going to
afternoon. Can everybody hear me in the back? You all right? Cool. So, just first, big love to the panelists. And also, we want to take a moment to just shout out Sophia and Raz and my roommates. Best roommate in the world right here, y'all. Best roommate in the world. Just for opening up the space for a conversation, for a presentation, and for me and perhaps others might be able to say the same thing. It was very impactful. So I just want to put some level in the space. So part of what I understand to be one of the major kind of intent points of PYM in this space, and this is just kind of from talking with some of the organizers as well as kind of breaking bread with some of the family over the past couple of days, is wanting to, among other things, equip you all, right, participants with a range of different analytic tools, lenses, not just to kind of put in your tool belt, in your tool set, right? So with that being said, I want to lift up kind of two major things for these next few minutes as we try to bring this part of the conversation home. So one of those major things I want to just add on to the spectrum or the trajectory of just another analytic tool, just another lens. We've had a range of lenses so far over the past couple of days, a range of lenses kind of been able to add for our consideration even on this panel. I just want to add one additional. So that's kind of that's one piece. And the second piece, I want to lift up and offer for this space just a few remarks on like method. And by method, by there I'm trying to highlight been a lot of conversation here and perhaps at this stage of movement building in terms of like what it means to be in effective, fruitful coalition work, solidarity work, language, however we need to language. So part of what I want to lift up is just some brief thoughts on what it actually might mean in terms of a how to do that, right? It's a matter of how we enter a space, right? Which implicates all of the other possibilities of the space. Okay, so an analytic frame and then a method remarks, and hopefully we can kind of see even in the trajectory of this panel, we had the first few folks kind of with the turn to the internationalist, the Pan-Africanist, the cosmopolitan, and the second few of us really try to go incisively on what it means to do this type of work, like in a domestic U.S. space, but still with a lens to the international. I want to open up with just with the brief moment, right, with the vignette. I'm a storyteller, and I want to kind of invite you all into that space as something that's important to me. So in May of this year, at one of my institutions, there was a panel conversation where it was kind of brought about by a Jewish rabbi in the city of Chicago, very powerful leader in the JUF in Chicago, Jewish United. And the panel conversation, full of participants that he himself selected, was on the theme of Christian Zionism, right? And there we can kind of shorthand understand this as, so we have the nation-building sensibilities of the Zionist logics, but kind of foregrounded in a Christian theological ethic, right? So that's the God claim. That is the claim that nation-building here is important in terms of the sovereign state, right? In terms of Israel, nation-building is important because Israel is the land of God's chosen. So that is the lifeblood of the Christian Zionist claim, right? So the rabbi holds this space, and it is in direct response to a workshop that some others of us sponsored at the institution last academic year, where we were trying to put a few Jewish, Muslim, and Christian thinkers together to reflect on this conversation of Palestine. Okay, and the panel conversation had concluded a moment opened up for Q&A, and some folks were kind of coming with heat, critiques of imperialism and settler colonialism, and all of a sudden, in giving some of the responses, the rabbi stood up in the middle of the assembly and said, "Stop, stop, stop. You Christians do all this talk about how important narrative is, important the story is to our project of nation building. You want to talk all this stuff about imperialism and conquest. For us, that's not at all what this is about. Right? For Jews, this is not at all about conquest. Unlike the United States, we draw a very sharp distinction between any of these questions of religion and those of politics. As a matter of fact, what we are about is self-determination, individual rights, property rights, and democracy. Okay? So that resonated with me on such a visceral level that my body responded. Right? My body responded. And some of this, as we kind of transition, some of this, for me, came out in so many words in the question that I posed in response to this comment, which was kind of in two parts, kind of coalesced around, on one level, what exactly, I said, does that mean? Right? What exactly do we mean here? Democracy, right? And individual rights and property rights, especially in the context of a nation-state building project where persons, people are valued as property, as chattel. So what do we now mean by individual rights, right? And for me, as a black dude from the United States, that resonated with my ear in a particular way. And furthermore, I don't quite understand why we're trying to have the conversation about nation-state building, especially in the 20th century, as if it is not foregrounded, right, in this language of the religious and the theological, right? Any moment where we are talking about an imperial conquest project that is foregrounded in the language of the cosmos, foregrounded in this language of what we are destined to, right? What we are entitled to in some teleological sense. At that moment, your whole enterprise is both blessed theologically as it is simultaneously sanctioned politically. So that was the moment. That being said, this is the analytic. For those who are kind of interested in taking notes. And I'll phrase it, I'll pose it in question form as one possibility. What might be the possibilities present in carrying in our movement building ethic, both that religion is and has been a tool of colonialist oppression, while at the same time holding that religion is and has been also a tool to critique it. That's the analytic frame, right? And in a broad sense, how might we be able to effectively make use of this weird, complicated sort of relationship between religion and politics around the construed? Now that analytic, in my case, kind of, and in my work, kind of boils down, and it looks like this. Insofar as we can have a conversation, and conversations about the ways in which there is a robust and strong and fruitful history of black folks in the United States joining in their anti-colonialist efforts, right, abroad, Latin Americanist world, in Palestine in particular. Insofar as that is an important part of the history, right? Worth invoking, worth celebrating, worth lifting up. There's also another history that has to be held, I think, simultaneously. And that is a history of the ways in which black folks in the United States also have come and continue to participate in some of the very systems of oppression that we claim to disavow. Right? And kind of linking this, I think, in my mind, back to a larger like PYM theme of the complicatedness and the messiness of the relationships and the tensions present to our internal communities. Right? This is, in my reading of this work in the United States, one of the legacies, and particularly of Zionism, as it has been formulated, 21st century in particular. Here's what we know historically. On one level, we know, about the ways in which Ashkenazic Zionism has always been a white supremacist separatist movement, right? Which is why the folks fled to Tel Aviv to get away from the Arab city folks in Yafa. Right? We can have a conversation about some of the reach and the tentacles of Zionism, in context, right? In Palestine and Israel. One thing we don't always, I think, in my experience, talk about is, again, the ways in which Black U.S. Americans have also come to reassert and re-script some of the very eerily similar logics of anti-Blackness and Zionism against other Black folks. Against other Black folks, in particular, poor Black folks. Nowhere is this more present for me than in Afro-Christian spaces, Black Christian spaces in the United States. For instance, one of the major obstacles and impasses in doing the work that I've tried to kind of engage in since 2013's Palestine justice work in those Afro-Christian spaces is the ways in which Black Christian folks in the mainstream, by and large, are not really trying to hear much about Palestine justice or the right of return, largely foregrounded in this moment where our sacred scripture communicates Israel as God's chosen people, and there's the conflation between the Israel of our sacred text and the 21st century sovereign state. So now, a whole bunch of folks thinking that any questions of Palestine justice is an affront to God, which is a faith claim, right? One example. Two, in the past several years in particular, AIPAC and JUF have launched very sophisticated campaigns intervening into historically Black college and university campuses, right? I'm an HBCU product myself. And Black Christian churches, giving thousands of dollars. Black church leaders, $4,000, $5,000, $7,000 of dollars, paying for trips to the Holy Land, so that folks can come back and preach to their congregations, advancing their communities very pro-Israel, pro-Zionist rhetoric, again grounded in this Christian Zionist impulse. And $4,000 or $5,000 means a lot when you're talking about poor Black church communities. Example two. Example three, the ways in which white Christian Zionists in the United States have deliberately tried to reach out to and partner with Black Christian spaces and Black non-Christian spaces on this logic of, well, we have a historical relationship between Black folks and American Jews in the United States that has everything to do with this groundedness in the historical civil rights movement moment. We fought alongside each other. We locked arms and we fought oppression together, right? So mythologizing that particular relationship, romanticizing it, and now using that as a platform to continue to launch particular sorts of sensibilities. Right. There are, however, others in these same Afro-Christian communities that understand the fundamental commission of the Christian scriptures to be fundamentally a political one, that understand the fundamental teachings of our prophet to be precisely about speaking truth to systems of necropolitics and empire. As the story goes, brother was executed for treason. Okay? It is not because of all this God talk he was doing. It is because of the ways in which this God talk was tethered to, foregrounded in his critique of Roman imperialism. Right? Well, don't get executed for treason merely because of God talk. Right? And in this case in particular. So, insofar as unequal distributions of power, necropolitics, and Zionist enterprise continue to evolve, right? Presently, continue to evolve. One of the lenses that some in our community try to go back and reclaim and redeploy is precisely this one. So, another analytic to pile upon the ones we've already experienced. That are just open for our consideration. As we transition really quickly, so I wanted to open up with this moment, right, with this story, with this episode, because stories are interesting things, right? You know, we all have them. You know, we tell them, we journey with them in an interesting way. We kind of are them, right? You know, what are we but compilations of the intersections of narrative, right? For some of us, those are familial narratives. For some of us, those may be migration narratives, community narratives. And when we offer them, these stories, especially when they are about us, we are offering something into the space that's important for us, right? Sometimes what we're offering is sensitive. Sometimes it might be scary. Sometimes for some of us it might be sacred. But regardless, we are offering something that matters, oftentimes with the hope and the trust that whomever is on the other side of that storytelling will be able to hold those stories with us, right? That's just one side. There's another side, which has everything to do, in my estimation, with the degree to which we are able to hold space with folks. Again, this is a method now. Hold space with folks, humbling ourselves such that we don't assume that we are the only ones that have a monopoly on truth. Right? But what might it mean to be able to engage in space and hold space with folks, listening to others' truths on their own terms, and presuming that it is truthful, it is sacred in itself. Right? That's about that is about how we enter. And sometimes that does come with critique, sometimes that does come with accountability, absolutely. But part of what I want to offer to the family here is a process that I have elsewhere called storytelling as truth-telling, right? And how we might be able to hold each other in those spaces so that the depth of whatever we might call this coalitional relationship building will be worth something more than just a photo op, right? More than just a picture I need because, me and my brother look different. I need to put it on the grant application for the next funding cycle, right? So I'm hoping, again, just as a last turn, returning to this piece about Zionism, please do understand that there are certainly some of us, and speaking on behalf of speaking in terms of from the vantage of a Black U.S. American Christian dude, right? There are some among us, myself included, that understand a particular type of white supremacist Zionist logic and sensibility as one of the cornerstones of this failed project of U.S. democracy. It is one of the serpents wrapped around the legs of the table upon which the scroll of the founding fathers were written. Right, and insofar as we continue to reclaim the parts of our traditions that are worth reclaiming, to deploy them for anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist exploitation domestically and globally. My hope and prayer is that we will continue to work together when it makes sense to do that. So.
Casual brilliance, like floating around the room, right? Just kind of trying to maybe synthesize before opening up to questions. So we've had folks touching on themes of discord within understandings of Islamophobia, right? So a lot of times politically, especially in the 21st century, understanding Islamophobia in a post-9/11 context. So erasing the intersections of Islamophobia and anti-Blackness that were prevalent in the United States in references to the Mossad being here and targeting Black liberationist movements, right? Also having reference to, I think Jervon touched on it really well, the different types of Zionism that exist, right? So sometimes the ways in which the concrete emphasis on militarization erases the ways in which forms of economic and imperial praxis creates really harsh material living conditions in other ways. And also still intersecting that with anti-Blackness, right? And I think looking more also with reference to Senyaka, talking about what is the concept of even continent, right? So when you have folks that are coming from communities that exist in so many different land spaces, how even does defining something regionally constrain how we can envision what types of political movements or liberationist movements we're going to be structuring around that? And how does it disrupt our ability to kind of imagine a broader understanding of liberation or a new world? And I think something also really important to leave that was touched on is the erasure of radical resistance that's perpetually taking place in the United States, right? So always perpetuating this assimilationist model as kind of the model of critical Black work in the United States, and erasing the fact that there's perpetual movements building towards critical Black autonomy and all of these different ways challenging police violence, but also challenging resource control, right? And asserting self. And I think also getting into Ethiopia as a sort of third world imperial democracy, really looking at how there are these complex positions of intense subjugation and political violence, but also still strongholds of recreating global warfare within the world and civil tensions. And lastly, in terms of Torian, this sort of analytic lens, I think when we kind of think of the relationship between religion and resistance in the Palestinian framework, looking at different examples of how Islamophobia is used to target Palestinian resistance, and in different moments, Islam has also been the foundation for political movements and auto trajectories, and also looking at how, in these ways, there are times that religion is sort of manipulated to further a state power and infrastructural power, justify horrible violence, but also recentering how we're thinking of that kind of process and political project, right? So not only, I think Joanna was touching on, not only looking at things through one political lens, so how can we use religion as a way to also open up the conversation and analysis of all of these different kinds of movements. I just kind of wanted to, I know, because we've been listening to so many different things, just kind of give some different talking points that you all kind of echo back. But we kind of thought it'd be nice to open up to questions. Open up to questions for a solid while. Lunch is going to be pushed back for a bit, obviously, but you all still get the same amount of time. It's just going to be later. But we just have some amazing folks here today. We really want to get to, spend time and build. So, opening up to questions. Unless any of you have any specific last remarks you want to make before opening it up. So doing stack. Iman, I saw your hand first, and then Nahdeen, and then Fatin, and then Rama, and then Lubna. Oh, sorry, yeah. Hold on, just a moment. Wait. Hands up. Okay, Iman, and then Nahdeen, and then who did I say next? Fatin, Rama, and then Lubna, and then Yahya. Okay, and then Sami, and then Zakiya. Okay, we'll take this group for now.
Somebody else.
I get it.
Somebody else over there. Behind you again? No, there's somebody else. Oh, they left.
No.
We'll start with Amen.
Right.
Sophia?
Thank you all so much. This was really amazing, and it gave us so much to think about. I guess my question is directed to something Christian said, but I feel like anyone else can answer it, because you mentioned Ethiopian Jews, and I guess my question is around strategy and practice when Palestinians have to, or Palestinian activists have to deal with the question of Ethiopian Jews when they are for dismantling the state of Israel, that kind of offers Ethiopian Jews the kind of protection that they need. So kind of thinking through how to address that question, how to address, understanding and being compassionate as refugees towards other refugees, who then, some of which enlist in the army and become indoctrinated into the Israeli state, kind of critiquing that without verging on using or appropriating kind of language that is racist or anti-black. So I guess my question is, because you all mentioned language, what is your advice on the kind of language to use to synthesize or reconcile addressing Palestinian liberation and state, and not necessarily statehood, but the dismantling of Zionism through the state of Israel without trumping on vulnerable subjects under the state?
MashaAllah.
Can we take a question?
Again, I want to echo the sentiment that you all are amazing. I hold every organization here in high esteem, and it's amazing that you came to speak to us. I really want to touch up on or add something to what you were saying about Caribbean communities and how Israel goes into these countries and economically exploits them. And I'm sure it doesn't just happen there, but it also happens in the U.S., in places like New York, Brooklyn, Crown Heights, where the Zionist Jewish landlords are fueling gentrification in Caribbean communities and places where Haitians, Jamaicans, Guyanese people live. Destabilizing the places that they live so that they can get them out of their rent-controlled apartments when they can't high up the rent, and they have Israeli flags all over. They have police mobile command units in front of synagogues in black neighborhoods that project shadows of dreidels onto the neighborhoods. Or I've known black people who can come out on Kingston Avenue, where it's the epicenter of Zionist Jewish people in Brooklyn, and then Jewish people will stop them and be like, "What are you doing here? This isn't your place. Get out of here." So my whole thing with bringing this up is that I think the conditions are ripe for not just solidarity, but not just allyship or solidarity, but accomplices coming together as Palestinians and as Black liberation, for this struggle. Especially because I think, in my analysis, that the most important kind of Palestine work that we can do in the United States is defeat U.S. imperialism from within, which is by supporting oppressed nationalities, as the U.S. is a house of oppressed nations, to achieve their liberation. That's what I think ultimately we should do. Even in building Palestine work now, from the organization that I come from in New York, our analysis is so that once we politicize them, is to use our manpower, our resources, everything that in service of the Black liberation struggle. But it kind of hits there. That's where we reach, and I want to take it further, and I want to use your expertise to further analyze how exactly do we do that, and what advice you have for people in this room, you know, and not like necessarily the particularities, that's for us to figure out based on where we come from, but generally, how do we do that, and like if you also, what you think of this analysis and stuff like that. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for being with us and for offering all that you've offered to us today. I have comments and a question. The Ethiopian Jews question, I'm really looking forward to the answer to Iman's question, because that comes up a lot in our communities. How do we, because some people will just say, you know, they're colonizers as well, and like, we don't care. And others will bring up like what Iman has said, like the sentiments of how can we be careful about that? How do we frame our work around that kind of stuff? Last year, there was a conference in D.C. in which Feiruz Sharqawi, an organizer with Grassroots Jerusalem, actually addressed something about this, and she said that it's not even just Ethiopian Jews who served in the military. Others like Palestinian Jews, for example, and other people of color that serve in the military oftentimes be like the worst offenders in the military, but that's really because they're trying to prove their whiteness in the military, like how white they are. Like they're just trying so much to prove how much they can be like the rest of like the white supremacists that control everything out there. And I think like as you were talking as well about like the Christian people of color, Christian Black folks here in the U.S., I think that you can even say that it plays out here as well in the context of the United States, that maybe people of color here who identify as Christians might also try to prove their whiteness as well within like the Christian context, right? Because we're out here. So you see like it's not just Black folks, obviously it's all kinds of folks that have to prove something as well. So maybe they're more excited to engage in this kind of stuff because of something like that. At least that's I kind of drew that link out there. So, and the third thing I wanted to say is, every time I hear that, like, you know, something happened in solidarity with Palestinians, like people who were, you know, like who made a sacrifice, like the Union, for example, that passed the PYM resolution, and there wasn't enough support. Like it kind of, nobody came out and supported it. Nobody did anything. My first instinct is to be on the defense kind of thing. Like, what do you mean? Like, I heard about it and we were really excited for whatever. At the same time, I totally understand that like there's a lack of, sometimes there's a lack of communication and a lack of ability really to come out and support sometimes, because we're all oppressed communities out here and we all deal with things of like lack of resources, lack of funding. Why is it, for example, that people didn't come out to North Carolina in support of the Union? At the same time, you have like AMP and CARE releasing statements about the Armenian genocide the way they did, and that was incredibly grotesque, right? I think it's funding and resources and things like this, like just being like where power lies, really. So I kind of wanted to pose a question of how we can come out, like considering all our situations, considering how can we be there for each other, but like in remembrance of the context of how we live as oppressed communities, as surveilled communities, as communities that need resources, as communities that have to protect ourselves. And I also, please remind me, or don't leave, because I really want to make sure that the people close to North Carolina can come out for the assembly,
Yeah.
New York and whoever else. So thank you again.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in some of the responses of the other panelists. We have, particularly on the first and the third question, regarding like, the existence of Ethiopian Jews in Israel. Oh, so thinking about the existence of Ethiopian Jews in Israel and their deep investment, right, in maintaining the state of Israel. Someone alluded to how oftentimes it is folks, the IDF soldiers who, whether or not they're Arab or they're Black preserve rights within Israel. And this is a huge challenge. I think we always center, right, like settler colonialism, and root our struggle in that. When attending a protest in the United States, I would never attend a protest, right, where someone is carrying the American flag, right? And so I couldn't imagine asking a Palestinian to attend a protest, right, perhaps that is about an Ethiopian Jew who's experienced anti-Black police violence, to attend that march if they're waving the Israeli flag, right? And so there's a question of like how we have these critical dialogues about settler colonialism, right, with folks in our community, with other oppressed individuals and communities. And it is such a challenge, and I think, you know, it also challenges us to think about like the degree to which we're willing to relinquish like the commitment to our own individual communities in an effort to realize that we're struggling for the liberation of all people, right? And I think that's something that's a recognition that many Ethiopian Jewish activists in Israel haven't come to acknowledge, right? They're so focused on their own immediate material conditions and mobilizing within the Israeli state that they are unconcerned about the liberation of Palestine. They refuse to acknowledge the history of the land. And I've engaged in conversations with Ethiopian Jews who live in Israel, and it is a challenge because it's like a real roadblock, complete disagreement. But I think we have to be persistent. Sometimes it's like not the responsibility. I don't think it's the responsibility of Palestinians to have these conversations with Ethiopian Jews. And it really does come to a place where those of us who have this critique of settler colonialism have this conversation within our own community, you know.
The one thing I might add a little bit on that first question too, just kind of taking an example from Haitian history, is that there's an ongoing tension between Haiti and Cuba, and that there's ways that sometimes conversations have to happen over time, and actually that as different nations we need to show up for each other and show solidarity in a way that allows us to then have a conversation. So an example for me of that is the conversation between Haitians and Cubans didn't start with you had exploited our people on sugar plantations and massacred many. It started with we will show up with doctors and nurses as a part of our work without asking you to return funds or this is a grant that you have to pay back, but just that as humans, recognizing that you have human rights that also need to be addressed, and we have the ability to address them. And it doesn't give any answers beyond to say that the conversation isn't just in words. I think it's also in actions and how we build out those community structures that allow us to see that actually we have alignment and we see each other. And sometimes that starts just with conversations that aren't about what are the larger strategic goals, but just meeting each other. And sometimes it's about seeing what are the resources that we have as a community that we can offer to another to start to build a wider conversation that can start to include how folks are aligned with white supremacist structures, Zionist structures, etc.
Yeah, mine actually kind of melted pot together a little bit because in my head I was thinking, and when I was like, what did I miss? But I do think I had this white older woman kind of tell me this big conversation question word of like solidarity, and then we put a verb on an act of solidarity. So she's like, how are we actually showing up for people? And her piece was like, well, I don't see myself as an ally. She's like, I'm a revolutionary. We talked about legal revolutionary workers, and her comrades were like, was out of like the auto work in the union working in Detroit, and so Gracie Boggs or James James Boggs that we might know, like of their writings, of their workings. And she was like, I've just never had this question of ally. If I believe that I'm a revolutionary, I see something wrong that's happening, then I have to act up and see. And so that kind of what popped for the first question and a little bit of the second question with gentrification. If we have these pieces and what you all were looking up, like if we have these places of alignment that do exist, because if our broader analysis is that we're fighting imperialism, we're challenging settler colonialism, we're really like challenging capitalism, then we know that it is on us to show up and understand other folks' struggles, even if that's not a lived experience, that they're still our duty and how we create the world. And so I was just thinking, this thing around decolonizing narratives, I think allows for us to really understand that our liberations are linked, because what was coming up and not really knowing about the Armenian genocide and stuff that happened, and oftentimes I was saying that even with like the Palestinian history and the nation came to pieces of like my organization, my movement said that this is where we stand on this position. And so I was like, cool, I fall in. But then it's like about understanding oppression in the history that I'm living in and I'm experiencing as being a person without, per se, land tied to go back to, then understanding that, oh, you are a U.S. citizen, but no, we actually are a nation and we have rights to our land. It was like, okay, cool, and I did more history on the Palestinian struggle. It was like, yes, that makes sense. And so I don't know, and as people, we may not always get like language correct, and we should be not per se sensitive, but I think be aware of like how we move in. But I think when we move from a place of alignment, like can we agree to, like what does it mean to be, I guess if we want to say active solidarity around like how we engage with Zionism, how we engage when movements are attacked for being anti-Zionist, when we, and so yeah, I think it's this piece around how we show up, but when we lay into our foundation that this is our position, that we are anti-imperialist, we are anti-colonial, or yeah, definitely anti-colonialist, but anti-capitalist, then I think sometimes there's an easier way to come to share positions, and it's our duty to fight, and then we show up in those actions.
So the last part of the union issue. So the question was about UE Local 150, which is the largest public workers union in North Carolina, run by rank and file black workers, sanitation workers, bus drivers, housekeeping staff, who passed the BDS resolution. I think the challenge, at least not generalizing, but in North Carolina and working with the Palestinian community, is conceptual challenge right now. That even understanding that the linkage between anti-black racism and Palestine struggle is a struggle for us. We have a considerable Palestinian community which is very active on BDS, but the people that work is Jewish Force of Peace and some white folk, but not with them. And also it happens, I think, because of the specific class character of the community, which is wealthy, middle class, professional, that want to keep away from the union. And it's not just with the BDS, but many other issues. For Islamophobia too. I've been in international gatherings with Muslim, immigrant Muslim, non-black Muslim, who are very adamant that keeps Islamophobia separate from racism. It has anti-black racism. So conceptually, first of all, is a big issue for many people. They don't want to overcome that. The other, how do we show solidarity? Well, join the union. They are organizing people. They did the biggest sanitation worker strike in Raleigh and won. They did a moratorium on death penalty and won. I mean, this is a union that's making history on the ground. Let's join it. Let's help as a matter of solidarity. If you cannot join, contribute to them. Help them. Do flyering. Come to their events. There are many ways we can do, which so far is not, but we are hopeful that in the future we will be successful.
Okay, the next round of questions is Rama, me, and Yahya.
Yeah, so thank you for being here. This is my question is more directed at I think one of the questions that we've been grappling with is how do we, as people living here, how do we justify our presence when the U.S. is a colonizing settler state? And for me, I answer that by, again, like centering the work of the right of return. But the issue now is that we're not here by choice. A lot of us immigrated because of either from the Nakba or later, wars, and that But should we gain the right of return, then we will have the option of returning to Palestine. So I think in your case, that's different. Like you said, you don't know where to place yourself. You also do not come to the U.S. by choice. So in your work and in your ideology of revolutionary nationalism, how do you reconcile the idea of nation building within this empire with the fact that there are indigenous people here? So like how do you reconcile those movements beyond just taking an anti-imperialist, anti-colonial stance?
Thank you guys for coming. Arabic we say Akichimafia. I do not know how to translate that, but God gives you strength.
Well-being.
You're doing like a great job. You know what? That's the one thing I want to learn how to translate because I never know how to do it. Anyways, I have two questions, and one is for Mansour and the other is for Christian. For Christian, I think I just came back from being in Palestine, and I think one of the most interesting things that I found is that like even within the daily life of just traveling like through borders or going to the 48 territories or being in the West Bank, one of the most interesting things that I find is the amount of immigration that's coming inside of the 48 territories. Outside of just black folks, outside of folks that are, joining the military. So where did we go? We went to when we went up north to the Lebanon border. We went to this area called Ras al-Nakura, and I was kind of taken back because at the border between Lebanon and the 48 border, there was a Chinese soldier at the border. And I was really shocked by it because, I see Ethiopians and Eritrean Jews all the time, and I see, Arabs, I see white folks all the time, at the border. But it was really interesting because I saw this is the first time I've ever seen a Chinese soldier at the border. And when I was exiting the country, I was being interrogated by an Indian woman. So it became really interesting, I think, the concept of like race and who has power in race and the way that race looks different, essentially transnationally and all over the world. But more in particularly who holds power inside of the 48 territories and how that power is being transcended into the indigenous Palestinian population. So I guess my question is, and also because for a long time I've been working in student organizations, I've worked with the Genovese and Palestine students, and at San Francisco State University, and one of the things that I found the most frustrating to me was the role of the Black students and essentially BSU on campus, and the types of conversations that they were having within BSU about Israel, and the types of people that were involved inside of BSU that were Ethiopian and Eritrean that had family members inside of the 48 territories that were extremely clashing against those that were working on popular movements inside of San Francisco State University. And so parts of BSU were not taking on certain positions because of the fact that fundamentally they do not believe in the state of, and fundamentally they were saying because of how Islam and how a lot of members that were a part of the BSU are a part of the Muslim Brotherhood, we're not taking decisions on Israel, but then we're also not speaking publicly about the things that were happening internally. So there became a complete divide that was happening at San Francisco State University between the Palestinians and the Black folks on campus, and therefore, like even when it came to coalition building and when it came to working together, there was just a complete distrust that was broken. So I guess I'm trying to formulate my question, but like, how do we move beyond this anti-Blackness, this anti-Arab work that's happening transnationally? Like, it's not just happening within the U.S. and it's not just happening within the 48 territories, but it's fucking all over the place. And it's like pouring out. And I don't think any of us really know how to stop the lid from pouring because it just keeps spewing out. My second question is from Mansour, and this also relates into what you were speaking about, how the liquor store owners and the families that are inside of. My sister lives in North Carolina, and my family has had a long history of having stores predominantly in Black neighborhoods. Not necessarily liquor stores, but stores, clothing, electronics, whatever it is. And what I've tended to see is that because of the way that immigration has worked in this country and the language barrier, that there becomes a huge realm of violence just that's held within the store. Where a Black person will come into the store and all of a sudden be called the N-word, and then all of a sudden the store owner is being called a terrorist. So it's like this constant, like everyday lived reality that's within just the storefront. So I guess my question is like, how do we organize around places like this where there's storefronts, where there's store owners, where there's youth that also work within the stores? And how do we come into a transition or essentially into a process where we're able to kind of break these conversations and these taboos about how do we work with our community? So that's my question. Next is Yahya.
So I think both Roma and Linda both touched on sort of like the question I wanted to ask. So like just to add to Roma's question, I know sort of through my engagement with Young People last summer school and through social media, I know that in the work of the New African movement, there is sort of developed political principles and conversations with indigenous folks around how to navigate the idea of like land mass while also relating to indigenous claims to land. So in being very deliberate about like movement building together, I was hoping you all can share more about that so that a lot of us do have commitments to decolonization and to fighting Southern colonialism. So I don't want these things to feel like they're antithetical to like working with people on like revolutionary national African movement, right? And I know these principles are developed, so just asking you all to talk about that a little bit more. And then just as far as kind of what Luna was saying, I feel like sort of the conversation of anti-Blackness, it's come up in our conversations here, and particularly like in Monday. I feel like, or like on our very first day, I feel like sometimes this conversation sort of gets brought up in almost like objectifying and tokenistic ways that are more just about sort of like weaponizing the conversation, saying like, oh, we're not doing enough as a community. And I feel like partially because of the way that structurally the nation state is set up and like the global world order is set up, it's like almost there's no way to be doing enough because structurally, no matter what you do, unless you dismantle the structure, you're in a position where you're benefiting off anti-Blackness, you're benefiting off of settler colonialism. And I feel like that sort of sometimes paralyzes our conversations and paralyzes our movements. As far as like how do we approach challenging these things. So I'm wondering how can we, I guess, shift the discourse around that in ways that aren't just about like in a weaponizing way, like, oh, what about anti-Blackness in our community? But it's not really about addressing anti-Blackness. It's more about calling our community out as not doing enough. Like, how do we move it from just some way of like paralyzing work to making it more productive and more meaningful, in our relations, right? And I know you all talked about some of how Zionism is also like an anti-Black project, and challenging Zionism is also challenging anti-Blackness. But at the same time, we also talked about how Muslim and Palestinian spaces are also sometimes actively participating in anti-Blackness as well. So how do we hold these two truths engaged, meaningfully? Thank you all again.
All right, so I'm gonna get into some of the first question, but I do think it relates to the second question too. So the way we look at it, we've had one, just the history of our peoples here. The New African nation, along with many of the indigenous nations, got blood ties, we've got war together, against the same empire, right? And you can have, just similar to the presentation on the Armenian genocide, right? You can have a situation where you have multiple nations on, the same land, right? And so we've got strong relationships, American Indian movement, Chippewa Nation, Choctaw Nation, and there's been a history of one really trying to address this question about the land, right? What is our responsibility on the land? One, right? And then two, understanding that we are all involved in the different national liberation struggles against the same empire, right? And for us, we definitely see the new African independence movement being part of how the indigenous people get their lands back, right? Because we're breaking up the empire, right? By removing ourselves, from the United States, we remove we take away a big piece of the pie they use to oppress everybody else in the world. Right? The comrades in the Native nations, we've been building with them for years, centuries on these questions. Right? So I'm not going to say that all of them recognize us, but some of them do, right? Nation to nation, recognize us as a nation. Some will go as far as to say that we are an indigenous nation here because this is where our nation was developed. Out of all the different African nations people from the different African nations that were, brought here and formed into a new nation, right? Our nation was born here, right? Our nation was born here before there was a United States, and from the beginning, we count the beginning of it being 1526, South Carolina, on the PD River. Those are the first African. We're not counting the Jamestown piece, 1619. Right, that's British. Right, when the Spaniards brought our people over here, within the first 6 months, we had the first slave rebellions on the North American continent, in unison with the Native nations in North Carolina at the time, and ran the Spaniards back to Haiti, right? And set up the first Maroon Society on the North American mainland, right? And the relationships go back that far, right? And it's not to say that there haven't been disputes. There's always going to be disputes between nations, but we do see it as one, we have the responsibility for breaking up the empire for our own interests, but then two, right, we also have agreements with those nations about our right to exist on the land, what environmental pieces we need to uphold, we have agreements about upholding rights to sacred sites, and defending sacred sites on the territory, right? So those sorts of things, Yeah.
And I was going to say this before you transition. So even as early as the NO committee, we were at back April in conversations that I've been in with some of the Southwest. I know a lot of indigenous folks are saying, which we thought of a show of this alignment or just seeing each other. Our green is free of land, and the relationship to land of indigenous folks here is protecting land, thinking about what is our responsibility to land itself. So it was what if our show of solidarity was a free to land, protect the land? And so as Tiaka is talking about, we also just talk about even when we're talking about our nation and we get our land, it doesn't mean that we would even go and practice the way the empire relationship is with the land in the United States. So states and borders and being able to move, and those pieces I think is important to lift up. And what was lifted up from indigenous folks was that you also just can't blanket them in say that they're just one grouping of people. They say we have our own history of indigenous wars, because we are nations. We might be tribes more than just one body of indigenous people spread out across Turtle Island. We have a bloody history. We have some new agreements that were made, and we have some conquering where we conquered people. And so we would also have to think about those questions. They use Atlanta as what is known as Atlanta, Georgia. They was like that was conquered by like 4 nations over. If they look at the history of their people, and so I think like all those pieces go into play too. And I think that that's when it gets kind of back to like decolonizing narratives and really unearthing like histories. Really not so like the history that's not.
And there's another piece in this, like getting to one aspect of I think one of the previous questions. There's a thing in general about like moving. And this is going to be, we have the anti-racist arguments, right? But we're nations, right? We got to move from the place of like we're talking about the liberation of nations, right? We're not just talking about we have anti-black racism, yes, but when we look, and this is getting to Little's point a little bit, right? If we're able to get folks to see the national relationship, right? And we're like, okay, what's built up on the oppression of the indigenous nation there, right? Then the other pieces, you can kind of see it. You can kind of see it a little bit more clearly, And it's a hard thing because you got the race, you got all this race-based conversation that hides the actual like relationships of people in territory, right? We do like a political education thing with our scouts, right? And we're like, you got Chinese people they're from China, right? Nigerians from Nigeria, right? Black folks, what land? Where's black land, right? But if we're able to get it to a point to where the popularization of like national liberation struggles among migrants, right? Among like the HBCU like college kids, they're going on these learning trips, right? If we can get in their heads, like you're going to a place of many different nations, not just the one, right? First of all, but then two, like just because you're there, right? Just because you're there, know that there's know that you're relating to an imperial nation, know that you're relating to colonized nations, know that you're relating to like migrants from other nations, right? I feel like that nation over race piece is going to be critical, right? And like how to popularize it, we've been trying to figure that out for the longest time, right? But like there's something in that question in and of itself that gets to like what the rights are.
So about the question about the stores, I totally agree. That's one of the most contentious topics in the community when we talk about race relations. I was at a black radio show on Shaw University and I talking about that and mentioned about this tension that exists. Within a minute, we got 3-4 calls from black community saying they have this issue of racism from the immigrant-owned convenience stores, from disrespect, throwing trash out, not selling good, not just about alcohol, but also not even selling good fruit and vegetables. Sometimes they are decaying, firing black. So sometimes they purchase and fire all the black staff, and then these are gonna constant complaints we are receiving on an ongoing basis. So we are planning to work on that. There is one model in Chicago. It's called Iman, Inner City Muslim Action Network. What they have done is change the relationship of the stores to the community from a parasitic, exploitative class to somebody who's benefiting, a symbiotic kind of relationship. And I think they put an Iman certified store, and you have to, have a better relationship with the community. also support, black-led youth empowerment or other projects going on in the community. I'm not very well aware. It seems like very charitable, but it's still worthwhile. It's something where we can use our privilege. Many of the immigrants can use our privilege. We know family or community members. We see them in the mosque. We have levels of power to influence them, how to change their relationship. One concrete thing that we are looking in Raleigh, Southeast Raleigh, which is a heavily black neighborhood, is a designated food desert. It's a designated food desert. And there's a black food co-op there, Fertile Ground, which is an arm of Black Vocal for Justice. They grow their own fruit and vegetables. How we could get those fruit and vegetables to be sold by immigrant-owned stores. Mm-hmm. We can change relationships by having those strategic interventions. And I agree, this is not about shaming or paralyzing. I think the reason we are bringing it is because if we don't bring this thing, we are not even going to think about solutions. Mm-hmm. And we all have power, we all have influence. We can find ways to address these issues.
And just to add a little bit, I think some of it is that question of how do we start talking about nations so that we can think strategically, right? If we're coming here and let's say, for example, a main strategic goal is to fight for the right to return, but then we're taking part in the capitalist structure, paying taxes, and destroying communities that actually are going to be critical for our support long-term strategically, then we haven't thought out what is the long-term plan and how are we actually marching along that in a way that's reasonable. So I think part of it is how do we start having conversations as nations and then think strategically, to say that nations should each have a Jackson Kush plan so that we can then see how we're relating to each other and how our plans fit together.
Okay, we're going to have the last set of questions just because it's 3 o'clock and people are hungry. So the last 3 folks are going to be Sammy, Zach, and Sophia. And if folks have more questions, we can answer you. So, okay. Sammy?
Thank you again. Just to echo everyone else, it's really great. I have 2 questions that are both conceptual questions, I think, but they have, I think, really important implications. First is just about the proliferation of the term anti-blackness, and the fact that that term itself is in part proliferated as a result of the Afro-pessimist discourse in scholarship, and just trying to think about the fact that a lot of organizing is done, and a lot of organizers are using that term, but that the Afro-pessimist discourse, in a sense, is arguing that actually, it's a pessimist discourse and that anti-blackness cannot actually be eliminated from humanity, that it's an ontological condition of humanity. And furthermore, that there have been arguments made from that discourse that actually Arabs in particular are essentially anti-black, and that's evidenced by the trans-Saharan slave trade, which actually I think is yet to come up in our discussion. I think is actually an important thing for us to address because it's something that I think is often ignored among the Arab community, and just so much anti-black racism within the Arab community that I hear constantly, to be quite frank. So I guess my question does the idea, maybe anti-blackness is not necessarily as a term being used the same way as Afro-pessimists are using it, but if it is, does that sort of necessarily preclude whatever you want to call it, camaraderie, solidarity, working together on these issues? And I guess the second question is, and it's more directed at you, sir. I forget your name. I apologize. Tori. And it's thinking about your sort of thinking about an political analytic that directly addresses the issue of religion. And you talk about storytelling and teleology, which I think is interesting. And I guess my question, it's sort of maybe a suggestion, but also a question is, if you think about whether it's the Christian tradition or the Muslim tradition, the concept of the martyr is part of both of those traditions. And when you look at the Greek origins of the word martyr and the Arabic root of martyrdom in Arabic, both imply martyrdom as we traditionally understand, but also the idea of witnessing. And I guess I'm wondering if we can sort of think about a political analysis and a politics that sort of derives from that dyad of like witnessing and martyrdom. Considering the way so much of our solidarity, works in a sense that way. I mean, whether you think about the way Black Lives Matter sort of emerged as a general movement, or whether you think about the effect of the wars on Gaza in the past decade and the effect that's had on discourses and opinions, just witnessing martyrs, literally, in that sense, and how politics is emerging out of that.
So, thank you all for being here. My question is also directed at Torian. In terms of Palestinian liberation theology, there's a lot being developed from Palestine, and a lot of that is actually being applied here through the BDS movement in white churches. So we're seeing a lot of white churches divesting, preparing themselves for HPV-free, being politicized through Palestinian liberation theology. And like the Kairos document, which was started by Palestinian Christians. In terms of why they're choosing to target like white churches is because they're invested heavily. They're spending lots of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars invested in these companies that work in Israel, versus black churches who aren't necessarily invested in Israel, but actually receive money from Zionists. So I think it's the other way around. For that, I think maybe that's the disconnect that's happening, is that we're not really engaging with black churches. I think what the added value is from Zionists giving money is faith, because faith is actually sometimes stronger. So how do you deal with how do you begin to unpack that? And I know it kind of goes into the fact goes into your first the methodology of how we enter space. So how do we do that? So we're entering these white churches and saying divest because you're invested in these human rights abuses. But when it comes to faith, it's a very, really strong force that drives both parties, black communities and Palestinian communities are really faith-based communities. So in terms of that, how do you see
Just really fast, I don't mean to be hurt, but so there's vibes and minutes to get through these really dense, powerful questions. So maybe just more concise answers that we'll have time to unpack in the discussion that we're going through after. I don't want to take away really great questions, and I hear they're touching on a lot, but they're just really super time. Last person, Sophia.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here. That was literally fantastic. Great question is just especially a lot of us are from different states, and that's really cool because we don't always get to see each other. So we'd really like to know how we can show up for your organization specifically, and besides even just a Facebook link, what you all are working on right now, or what we can connect to, because I'm going to go back to California and I'd like to connect up with a lot of folks. So how can we all show up for your organizations?
The first question mentioned is about Afro-pessimism, which I think, I wouldn't conflate the use of anti-blackness broadly, specifically with Afro-pessimism, which is what I'll say about that. But I think your mention of the East African slave trade, or that's also known as the Indian Ocean slave trade, there are plenty of different names that are used to identify the slave trade that occurred in East Africa. And this is actually one of the challenges that we face when attempting to organize African communities around Palestine, right? And I think this kind of relates to the question that was asked earlier. So the memory of the slave trade is still alive and well, right? There were ports in Sudan, in Somalia, in Djibouti, in Ethiopia, and really contributes to the anti-Arab sentiment that actually exists and is very strong in East Africa, right? When I visited Holo's Detention Center last summer, there was a crew of, I was with an indigenous and people of color delegation, and there were both black activists, indigenous activists from this land, and Palestinians on our delegation. And we were having a conversation so it was like this, it was like this really difficult dialogue that we didn't figure out how to struggle through. There was not a solution to it whenever we left the detention center. But I think it's like really important to name that this is like one of the struggles that we're working against, and also understanding that like at the core, slavery is about economic imperialism, right? And so whenever we're struggling for liberation, we're not just struggling to recreate like a nation or a state that is dependent upon unpaid labor or white supremacy, that we're actually trying to recreate an entire economic system that, again, doesn't depend on underpaid or unpaid labor. But again, we like can't also ignore these histories and I think the other bit also that's important about like anti-Arab sentiment in East Africa specifically is that East Africans definitely conflate like notions of Islam and Arab. Like, they don't understand that. In fact, Palestinians, there's a very, very small likelihood that Palestinians, people who were indigenous to Palestine, were involved in the East African slave trade at all, right? But to East Africans, it's like all Arabs are one because there's not this like nuanced, complex understanding, again, of the political history of Swana. Yeah.
So I'll just interject really quickly with time. I wanted to say on this piece of anti-blackness, and I'll be around, so I'm totally down to go deeper. A few things pop up for me, like buzzwords trending this, us trying to always find new language to understand what we are experiencing now, and then I just try to fall back on decolonizing narratives, because if we were to actually name what it is that we're talking about, like even with your explanation, I think we're able to better describe what we're speaking of. The same way with like POC, but then we know oftentimes our languages that we choose to liberate and to struggle with gets used against us or resorbed in by the machines to then give it whole new narratives and definitions as if it didn't have a trajectory when it was born. And so I just really want to lift that up, because I was like, I do feel that we can document that anti-blackness can be real and that it does exist. And we also should understand that, there's some buzzword like trendiness to that. And so we really should seek to, even if we are categorizing some of these big phenomena of true lived experience that are authentic, we really invest in maybe like shared education and some like true like cross shares, because I can, like me being Taliba, I use these words maybe at times to communicate and to connect, but oftentimes I tend to use them in critique when we say, anti-blackness, because then what that does seek is the shaming that happens. It doesn't fully articulate what experiences we want to put our fingers on. The same way with people of color. Who are these people? And then we're still doing these things that erases us, that still doesn't get to our history. Then we can't even understand why we have these shared experiences. And so I would just want to maybe like put that out there, that we are in a time where we're creating words to describe these experiences that we're having, and maybe we don't have to be that per se sophisticated and challenge ourselves to name what it is that we're experiencing in that same language. That takes a little bit more time.
And just really, really quickly, Sophia, thank you for your interjection there. I just wanted to appreciate you for just offering that to the space. I share similar. I have this weird relationship, like oftentimes with language, phrasing, and terminology, especially kind of phrases that have these histories of contestation, right? And then an effort to like redeploy them as if it's possible to separate heavily contested terms from their histories of contestation. So to second to Lila's point, also, I've spent some time thinking about over these few days, but also like more in depth over the past several months. Intersectionality is another one of those terms that I'm like, yikes, right? Because the way folks are just throwing this shit out, man. Folks are deploying it, really seeming to like gesture towards like partnership or coalition in some weird way when that is and again in my reading, a complete bastardization away from what the term was originally deployed to expose, right? So just that piece about language. Zach and Sam, thank you for your questions and comments, both loaded and really important ones. Zach, really briefly, when talking about like the investment, I do think there's an interesting way in which this investment and even a material one kind of does go in multiple directions. I think about things like Black churches giving money, right, to tree planting campaigns, right, and they cut checks, right, that go to planting trees, right, but what kind of gets glossed over is the fact that the trees this money is going to plant are trees in the regions that are not indigenous to the land, that poison the land and are used kind of as a just one more wedge or one kind of more added layer into the overall equation of dispossession. Evacuating folks, from their native and indigenous land and foreclosing their possibility of returning to it. Right. So that's a tangible example of something that is happening in terms of material resource. Now, obviously it's not the type the sum of money that's kind of coming in the other direction. There's something to note. To your larger point about kind of a Palestinian theological frame. So one of the other hats that I wear, and I'm careful here. I do. I serve on a part of my context. I serve on the board of trustees of a U.S.-based organization that self-identifies as an ecumenical American Christian organization specifically dedicated towards Palestinian justice. And it is an offshoot, a satellite of the flagship organization that was founded by many standards, many estimations, father of Palestinian liberationist theology, right? So part of and so that's kind of one of the hats. One of my investments, my own beliefs, is that there is no one thing that exists called Christianity, or whatever other broad category we want to use. I think there are multiple, right, Christianities. You can sub in any, right, multiple representations of it. Historically, I'm invoking the fact that there is no way possible anyone will ever be able to convince me that the representation of Christianity that these slavers, these slave drivers, advanced in Jim Crow South or in the South plantation life during the chattel institution, right, convincing bondspersons that their God is telling them to obey, right? No way in the world. That is the same type of Christianity as folks like Nat Turner, Denmark, B.C. Gabriel, who were all black preachers.
Not saying we could. Amen.
So these are folks that were taken up arms, right? All rooted in their faith, right? So that's not the same. I would even go as far as we talk about different gods, right? And I'm wrapping this up. But bringing that to this conversation, I will say, and I'll go on record saying this, that there is in my reading, in my estimation, a way in which the ways in which Palestinian Christian theology is kind of deployed and taken up. I mean, I think the same thing of white kind of nation Christianity in the U.S. and same thing kind of black nation Christianity in the United States. Have a way of talking about things like inclusivity, the working in of other voices in terms of kind of gathering together in like joint liberation struggles that fundamentally still end up reaffirming white supremacy. Period. And that gets pulled in all this language of multiculturalism, diversity, tolerance, right? These moments when we're welcoming in, Muslim voices, we're welcoming in, other voices from a particular faith tradition. But lightweight, we still believe that we have that monopoly on truth. That's the problem, right? So that's one thing that I kind of wrestle with, which is interesting, kind of being in conversation and relationship with some of the authors of Kairos Palestine, and Abu Jamal in particular. One thing that was kind of communicated to me most profoundly, when we came up with Kairos Palestine, that was about our context, right? You see Kairos South Africa, pop up. By the time that we get to this Kairos USA document / claim / logic, the problem is these are folks in the U.S. not foregrounding the conversation in the internal U.S. problem, when part of what Kairos Palestine had hoped and had intended and had planned, according to the authors, was insofar as this kind of sparked these other documents, these other movements. We appreciate the solidarity stuff, but ground that in what's going on in your own context, right? So that's part of kind of what nuance that this conversation for me of the multiple Christianities at play and figuring out how all these things are in conversation with each other. It's made more difficult, when we're not talking, about things like white supremacy. I guess as a last point, Sammy, I think that the question you made is, or the point you raised is profoundly significant, right? And just as a brief word, and we can talk more about this offline. When I think about witnessing this process of bearing witness, that is a practice that's important to me. In terms of what I'm invoking in my faith tradition, that's also a process that's important to me in terms of how I'm invoking my own African ancestry, right? So again, what it means to bear witness, the race, the critical race heart in me always wants to ask that question, into what gaze, right? To whom and for whom, are we bearing witness, right? So is this a conversation about bearing witness for the purposes of recognition, right? If this is a conversation about bearing witness for some other purpose and pursuits, all important questions, I think. But to the point about witnessing in martyrdom, yes, right. Yes. And part of this also, I think, needs to mean an expansion of how we understand martyrdom. Yes.
Again, we're gonna have another workshop after lunch, so giving folks a chance to eat, refresh, rejuvenate, be able to engage all of these really powerful energies that we have